Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stoliarov II, and I am the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our U.S. Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon of September 3rd, 2023. Today, we are pleased to offer you a fascinating discussion of decentralized science and decentralized funding of longevity research in particular. Joining us today is our panel of U.S. Transhumanist Party officers and advisors, including our Director of Visual Art, Art Ramon Garcia, our 2024 U.S. Vice Presidential Candidate and Director of Community and Citizen Science, Daniel Tweed, our Legislative Director, Jason Geringer, and our Biotechnology Advisor and Founder and CEO of Sierra Sciences, Dr. Bill Andrews. And our special guest for today is Eleanor Davies. Eleanor is a deal flow steward at VitaDAO, the world's first decentralized collective funding company targeting age-related diseases and aging itself. She is a longevity enthusiast with a background in fund operations and consulting in healthcare and biotech policy and regulation. A graduate of the University of Manchester, she has grown as a professional serving in Marwood Group Healthcare and Biotech Consultancy, co-founding a company and helping to raise funds, deploy capital, and manage the portfolio at ODX, a Silicon Valley-based accelerator. And more recently, she has actively engaged with the DeSci, or Decentralized Science community, serving as COO of LabDAO. So welcome, Eleanor. It's a pleasure to have you here, and you have quite an extensive background in decentralized science, so we'll be quite eager to hear from you on that subject, as well as what VitaDAO is doing these days to achieve the funding of longevity research. So, Eleanor, please feel free to provide us your presentation, and then I'm sure we'll have a fascinating conversation to follow.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Gennady, for the glowing introduction, and it really is a pleasure to be here and doing this virtual enlightenment salon. It's great that VitaDAO is getting to the stage where so many people are getting attracted and are also so curious as to how decentralized science is really kind of becoming quite a disruptor in the way in which we look at longevity, and not just how it's done in terms of funding and accelerating aging research, but also how we get people excited about it, how we get it more popularized, and also how to engage the community on a really across stakeholders. And for me, that's why I'm also excited about DAOs. So I'll get into that a little bit later, but basically the title of my talk, I guess, is, and also something that I'd really like everyone to think about is, are we seeing a new epoch in funding aging research? And so what this is really is a new model and a different way of looking at funding aging research and accelerating scientific breakthroughs with decentralized science. And I mean, this is basically a new way of opening up a new and collaborative form of reaching consensus, also evaluating, diligencing projects, but also getting the community engaged and feeling as though they also have skin in the game in terms of the future of humanity, and also the way in which we approach longevity, and also how we define it. So without further ado, basically, so what the problem is at the moment with centralized science or traditional science. So first off, I'd like to talk a little bit about Eroom's law, which is Moore's law spelled backwards. It was a term coined by Dr. Jack Scannell initially in 2012, who's actually now, funnily enough, a part of the DeSci ecosystem and has also just joined VitaDAO's scientific advisory board. So it's funny how these things kind of work in, kind of come full circle. But anyway, it's basically the observation that drug discovery is becoming slower and more expensive over time, despite improvements in technology. For instance, high throughput screening, computational drug design, ChatGPT, and large language models. And specifically, it speaks to how and why the inflation-adjusted cost of developing a new drug doubling every 9 years. And a statistic to back that up that I came across, which is quite surprising, and I think it might also surprise the audience as well, is that in 2020, during the year of the COVID pandemic, the FDA approved just 53 new drugs. And in the same year, the global pharma industry spent nearly 200 billion in drug R&D costs. So the average cost per drug approved in 2020 was nearly 3.8 billion, which is quite astounding, actually. So that basically brings me on to the next point in terms of how we are operating under archaic institutional mechanisms and how research incentives are so misaligned. And so for any of you who have come across Tyler Cohen's philosophy and writings, and Jason Crawford as well, progress studies. Progress have been bottlenecked by systemic and institutional level issues such as I mentioned, archaic institutional mechanisms such as university tech transfer offices, the lack of commercial forward systems, the increasing regulatory burden, a lack of open source sharing of technologies, and the misallocation of capital that's prevented new drugs from reaching the market and therefore patients. And so final point on this slide is that historically, fundamental technological shifts have required new structures for collaboration. However, decades into the internet age, we still grapple with archaic institutions for governing and sharing value. So enter decentralized science as the potential solution. And, it's also just another way of looking at the different ways as to how we can create scientific progress, specifically in an area which is overlooked, underfunded, as longevity. So what decentralized science is it's a movement that aims to build public infrastructure for funding, creating, reviewing, crediting, storing, and disseminating scientific knowledge fairly and equitably using the Web3 stack. So I can get onto that in a little bit later, and also happy to take any questions from the audience. So DeSci hopes to create an environment where new and unconventional ideas can flourish by opening up access to funding, scientific tools, and communication channels. And so together, we've established a faster, open source, and more democratized incentive system through collaboration, which is based via token-based mechanisms. So basically voting and being able to make a decision via the token, which is a Web3 based unit of ownership. And this also enables a coordination of capital, talent, and also crowd intelligence. So Web3 blockchain at a structural level is basically giving us new advances in network and coordination, also incentive technologies that could reverse the trend of progress studies, or what progress studies is about, basically. And how we can basically optimize the hive mind that is in the scientific research community, and capital allocation as well for a specific cause. So I spoke about incentives mechanisms, and something to double tap on is, so basically researchers spend on average 50% of their time writing for grants. And another way of applying for grants is via the DeSci ecosystem. So for instance, Gitcoin, some of you may have come across if you're more Web3 native, but it's basically a lot faster way, a more democratized way, which is also voted on via community members of Gitcoin, and basically enables scientists researchers who are conducting their projects to get access to capital more quickly in a more democratized way. And happy to talk about that a bit later if anybody has any questions too. I understand that it could be a bit of an information dump, especially when it comes to Web3. So happy to talk about that and familiarize with anything that's unfamiliar. So this is a snapshot of the decentralized science landscape, and considering it only took off in February last year, ETH Denver specifically, there are already over 120 organizations as featured on this landscape here. So we're really sort of seeing a Cambrian explosion of basically coordinating mission-aligned people in a community towards something that is basically a systemic problem and that we're looking to solve collectively. Of which VitaDAO, where I lead as deal flow steward, and what we are is the leading BioDAO, which is funding and advancing longevity research and drug discovery. So you may be asking, what is a DAO? She's been talking about a DAO. I have no idea. Is this the Tao Te Ching, the Dao Te Ching? Like, what is this? It's a decentralized autonomous organization. And what it is it's an emerging form of legal structure. As defined by Investopedia. And what it is it's a collective of people who are very mission aligned, who share a common goal and act in the best interest of the entity. So very similar to a company, except DAOs are used to make decisions in a bottom-up management approach, whereas in companies in Web 2, as it's traditionally referred to in the Web 3 community. So top-down is the more company approach. Also, in terms of Web3, those who may not be familiar with that terminology, it's a kind of idiomatic way of referring to the maturation of the blockchain space. So what is a DAO? It's an umbrella under which everyone in longevity can function, from biotech operations to key opinion leaders, investors, researchers, and the community, i.e. patients, enthusiasts. Anyone is able to join, it's fully open, there's very low barriers to entry, and the focus on community and basically getting everyone excited to advance research in the field. And so what we're also doing is we're getting people really excited about longevity, and we're also attracting people from all different age ranges and across the world. So it really is a community-led and very young, very fresh, but also, we need to think about who the next leaders of longevity and aging research are going to be. And what VitaDAO also strives to do is to nurture and help accelerate the next Aubrey de Grey, for instance, or the next Natasha Vita-Moore in the longevity field, and really provide them with the resources to thrive and also build off what the leading stakeholders, key opinion leaders in longevity are already doing, and opening it up, becoming frictionless, and reducing the notion of the ivory tower, that anecdote that is referred to quite a lot in science, and making it a lot more approachable, which also kind of has a downstream effect as to how we look at science, how we look at everything from the laboratory to spinning out a company to funding to patients, reaching patients. So it really is basically getting everyone excited, involved, and also educating as to how this works and also why it's important for society. So VitaDAO has only been around since 2021, but already we have funded 19 plus projects. And I say funded as well because we are an endowment, so it's not an investment per se. And that basically means that any carry is reinvested back into the DAO in order to fund more projects. So it really is, a not-for-profit. Just going through the metrics here. So we have over 9,000 members. The average ticket size is 25K to 1 million, and 6 million in treasury. So what's special about VitaDAO is that we're basically the servant leader organization towards progress in aging research. And everything we do is to enable researchers to be successful and utilizing the resources to enable them to achieve this mission, as I just mentioned. So with the first money in, highest upside potential, we, in terms of how our treasury is split, so from our previous strategic fundraise, where we were backed by a mixture of biotech LPs and also crypto, 20% of the treasury goes towards funding startups. So previous startups we funded are Turn Bio, HDAX, Clarity, and 80% of our treasury funds basically IP NFTs. So I can go into that in a second. But what this is the more venture studio component, where what we do is we go in, we work with entrepreneurial longevity aging researchers, and we help them with their translational research. Usually they're in the last 2 to 3 experiments in the lab, spin this out and build this into a company, into an entity that has a product, help with the screening, help with basically everything that's needed in a venture studio, in a typical venture studio, except this is more globally distributed. This is executed via the community. And it's basically a different way of looking at utilizing the community longevity hive mind. So we kind of bridge the valley of death here. So our tickets are generally smaller, however, it's more value-added capital. So we have a squad in VitaDAO called the Builder Squad. It's a collective of biotech operators, builders, investors, bioinformaticians. The community really is, pretty large, and we're already working on spinning out several companies as well. So as I've just spoken about, we discover and finance longevity IP, leveraging decentralized network effects. So the longevity deal flow working group, which I lead. So what is a pre-vetted working group, which is a part of the DAO as a whole. So VitaDAO is split into 3 working groups, of which one is deal flow, and it's basically a collective hive mind of academics, researchers, operators, and together we source and diligence assets, both in the laboratory and also startups, incubate ideas, improve them towards commercialization, and then make funding recommendations to the community. So it's not the community which is making the decision per se, rather the working group that works on the deals, who conducts the evaluation, due diligence, senior review as well, and then makes the recommendation whether the community should decide yes or no. And so the funding consensus is approved via Vita token holders, and this is what brings in the Web3 element. So Vita token is a token which represents ownership. It's a governance token, represents ownership of VitaDAO. So it's one token, one vote, and for, against, and basically that's how decisions are made. So I'm going to talk a bit about how VitaDAO uses IP digital assets and decentralized marketplaces as well. So this is more in the venture studio spin-out side, and taking a different look basically at how we spin out and build projects from the laboratory. So in a typical engagement, the IP is held on chain. So basically there's a digital replica of the IP, and this is held on chain. So this is basically on the blockchain representation of this. And what this enables scientific projects to do is to basically raise non-dilutive funding from the IP NFT. So NFT, for those who aren't familiar, is a non-fungible token. So you are able to transact this for real life currency, basically. So there is a token launch, and then a crowd sale occurs. So those who are supporters and want to fund and basically have some ownership via IP NFT can basically fund, make the transaction. And what this enables researchers or basically the team to do is to generate proceeds that are non-dilutive in order to further their project. So a example of this, which recently happened, was the VitaFast for Dr. Kowalczyk at Newcastle University. For those who are a little bit confused by the IP NFT, I'd be happy to share some links which would explain this a little bit further. But in short, this enables scientists, early stage companies, to de-risk their project before raising institutional capital in order to further their project. So this is a snapshot, as to how the IP NFT system works. So basically, it's intellectual property on a digital on-chain representation. An IPT is a fractionalized IP NFT, and they're basically fungible governance tokens. So not only are you able to raise proceeds via the IPTs, but also those who own the tokens enable members of the community to have a say as to how the project is going, also be able to use it as bounties for instance, contractors to the project. Can elaborate a little bit on that as well, but also vary over time. And this is also a snapshot from the latest VitaFast launch. So Dr. Viktor Kowalczyk and his laboratory they recently led a crowd sale, and it was oversubscribed by, I believe it was 1,700%. And this is basically how it looks. So yeah. And so a quick portfolio snapshot to the projects that VitaDAO has funded so far. So of the 19 projects, we have funded 17 spinouts and the remainder in startups. So deployed 4 million in capital to date since 2021. And so overall, what are the advantages of VitaDAO and why should everyone be excited? So it's about the community, basically. It's about, we are the largest researcher-led deal flow team in the industry. We provide in-depth due diligence, basically on a global remit, really, which is really exciting. And it's a community of mission-aligned people who are interested in longevity, who are interested in furthering it, and also looking at different ways to how scientific research is sourced, evaluated, and also conducted, brought to the next level. Our decentralized incubator model leverages the highest ROI early stage R&D and mitigates risk through portfolio diversity as well. And we're also leveraging it with industry leaders. So we're growing our treasury via biotech and crypto LPs. We recently raised, earlier this year, we raised from Pfizer. And we're also coming into deals with the likes of Apollo VC, Houseman Capital, Pfizer as well, and Backlist. So there's a real mixture there. The Vita token is tokenized membership that aligns incentives, it creates awareness, and it also allows for participation by the community on their own terms. So it's by any geography and any amount of hours, so work conducted into the DAO. The community has skin in the game, and token holders basically can participate in progress. So with that, I'd like to thank you for listening to the presentation, and I'm happy to open up the floor for questions.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Eleanor, for that quite interesting and eloquent presentation. I will ask the first question, and then we will go around the panel for any items that our panelists are curious about. So I would be interested to find out more about the governance of VitaDAO. So you have the token holders, you have the stewards, and then, of course, the name Vita doesn't only stand for life, it stands for Vitalik Buterin, who is quite a significant supporter of longevity and a funder of longevity causes. So I would be curious to hear about the involvement of each of these stakeholders.
Yeah, it's a great question, actually. And so, yeah, exactly. You mentioned, so there's Vita Core, who basically function as the board. That's with strategic contributors, also long-standing members of the DAO, and the stewards of the working group. And then there's also the community, the supporters, people who lead initiatives, and those who are lurkers in the DAO, token holders, people who are evaluators, diligencers of projects, but also more largely. So you mentioned supporters of the DAO and the community and the way in which decisions are made. So an exciting thing that we recently were working on was Zuzalu, which is a network city-state which is focused on longevity. And this is also in cooperation with the Ethereum Foundation and also Vitalik Buterin. So yeah, maybe we could discuss a little bit as to VitaDAO's role and the larger scale of involving community in making decisions. But it really is we're kind of looking at longevity, funding longevity, and creating awareness, and also bringing in the crypto community, which really has this ability, this Gen Z millennial ability to really create virality through community, to get great engagement, and also look at different ways of engaging everyone via meme culture even, or via internet communities. So we're really seeing like a mix, a melting pot of internet native communities, and with that decision making in VitaDAO. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, thank you. I think that helps. And there is a related question from David Wood. He wonders, in practice, how do the community votes inside VitaDAO tend to split at the moment? Is there wide disagreement among multiple candidate choices, or is the decision closer to unanimity?
Ooh, that's a good question. That's a good question. So basically, how governance is conducted in VitaDAO is via 3 different phases. So there's soft governance, which happens on Discord. On the Discord channel, there's like a thumbs up, thumbs down. And usually, so I mean, first off, if the proposal has common sense behind it and also acts within the best interests of the working group, then there's general unanimity. However, if it's something which is a bit more controversial, or something which is just doesn't necessarily make sense in terms of the DAO strategic vision as to what we want to achieve, then the opinions is a little bit more divided. And so the second phase of governance is done via discourse. So it's called gov.vitadao.com. And this is basically where there's so more public community discussion about building consensus for a specific proposal. So for instance, some of the projects that have been proposed for funding, for instance, have not been, not everyone has been in agreement. And so how that takes place is there's discussion. There's a lot of discussion. And one of the is a bug, is a feature, components of the DAO is that everyone has an opinion, and it's pretty much always in the best interests of the DAO. However, it can also mean that progress is or can be slow. However, this basically acts in the best interests of the community members. And if not everyone agrees, then it's voted down. If everyone does agree, and it's voted on. If there's more of a 50-50, like a 58 split in favor, say, then it's also about the implementation of that specific proposal. So in the context of funding a deal, so that would be funded maybe a smaller amount than what may have been promised, although I mean that hasn't really been done, to be honest. It's done for, if it's against, then I guess it's negotiated internally, as in like on the Discord channel, and then maybe it won't be implemented, or maybe it'll be suggested at a different time. It's that's kind of how it works. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, I think this is an interesting set of mechanisms. Our friend Daniel Tweed wonders, have you utilized any ranked choice voting decision-making style in VitaDAO as we do in the Transhumanist Party, where people are allowed to rank order the options, though I wonder if most of the time your options are yes and no, in which case it's more of a binary vote.
So we have done ranked choice before, not so many times on when it comes to a snapshot decision. So snapshot is the on-chain, the token voting. That's the name of the platform. A ranked choice, I can't say. I mean, it has been proposed by community members. So I mean, what we're doing at the moment is a VitaDAO delegates program, where you nominate yourself as a delegate, and it basically means that you act within the interests of a number of people in the community, and your vote has more weight to it. So that's kind of a component of the governance, and how that's evolving. Others have also proposed quadratic voting. Not too sure if you've ever come across that. It's quadratic voting is also used in Gitcoin, where basically at a high level, voters with a larger number of tokens, but whose choice is less popular, versus those who have a smaller number of tokens, but there are many of them. The latter side basically gets more allocation or more weight in favor, let's say, or that side gets more weight because the number of voters is recognized versus the weight of votes on its own. Does that make sense?
Yes, so essentially voting is weighted according to essentially willingness to pay. So people with more tokens, for instance, may be able to have more of an influence on the vote.
So that's how it works at the moment. However, there are other types of voting mechanisms that are out there, which means that those who do not have as many tokens, who however vote the popular opinion, versus those who have more tokens, but maybe vote in a separate opinion, but however there are fewer. The former is kind of seen in favor because it has a higher number of individual voters.
Interesting. So it's an algorithm that kind of takes into account both of these elements. So suppose I had 51% of the tokens and I had a preference in a certain direction, but that preference was not shared by anybody else in the community. I wouldn't just be able to say, I have 51% of the votes, and therefore my way gets implemented. There's some sort of multiplier, perhaps, that is less than one that is applied to my votes, and some multiplier that is greater than one that is applied to everyone else's votes.
Yes, it's something like that, basically. So Gitcoin has a really good explainer of how quadratic voting works. So I can't seem to find it on my saved bookmarks, but I would love to post that in the comments for everyone to understand it a bit better. And they explain it really clearly as well. I quite like how Gitcoin works. So they are a a Web3 grants funding organization, similarly to VitaDAO. Actually, they are an impact DAO, and have actually now deployed over 50 million in capital, not only to Web3 projects and also in longevity, but also partnered with UNICEF, have recently partnered with Shell, although it's had some controversy, but it's also just a sign that there are grants funding bodies out there that are funding longevity, which are Web3 native. And yeah, it's starting to come out basically of the Web3 ecosystem and into the broader world, and kind of being seen for being impactful.
Yes, thank you very much. And now we have a question from Zach Varkaris.
So I'm sorry, when I heard it a bit, I missed a bit of it. I was driving, so it was in and out. A little bit of understanding of Web3. I have a question about this voting. The thing is, what gives the person the authority to vote on a project? So in other words, so if you're doing a project that, say, I'm in the longevity world and we can reverse menopause in women, that's what we do, right? We can do that. So that's going to be interesting to a number of people, but not to another number of people. Guys don't even have a clue about menopause. So in other words, it's like, how do you determine that you're going to be voted on? Because the reality is, it sounds like democracy and that's all great, but doesn't mean you're qualified. It's like, if I'm falling down the street, I need help. I'll help you, but I'm not a doctor, but I'll help you anyway. Well, what's the help? So what's the justification of how do these qualify? So I just looked up quadratic voting and the Condorcet paradox. So, okay, I understand a bit of that now. So is there a weighted version? My question is there a weighted version on the voting whereby someone who has an understanding of the longevity community, understanding of medical issues, understanding of insurance issues, or something that's relevant to increased lifespan, increased health span, whatever, Freudian span, or whatever you want to call it, do they have a power of a vote, or is it just someone who has a token?
So when it comes to the voting, that basically is so those who have more tokens are able to vote in favor or not in favor. However, the work that goes in beforehand in order to make the recommendation is really where the actual subject matter expertise comes in. So I lead the deal flow working group, and what this is that it's a group of
Sorry, you lead the deal flow. You lead it, right? Sorry.
Yeah, correct. Yeah. Of which there are a number of experts, as in a number, globally distributed. There are 150 to 200. So we have biotech operators, investors, crystallographers, bioinformaticians, and they're pre-vetted before joining the working group. So it's myself and a few other people as well who basically, do the vetting before allowing anybody to work on any specific deals. And so in terms of who works on a deal, they are basically selected based on their background and relevance to the project and subject matter expertise. So they lead the evaluation, due diligence. There's also a senior review, which is conducted. So people who are in the senior reviewers are ex-NIH, ex-Pharma, for instance. So they are real subject matter individuals, and they basically provide the diligence, the feedback, refine the proposal, and then provide a conviction score. And if it doesn't pass, yeah.
So it's like an IRB review committee, basically.
Exactly. Yeah. Similar to that. Yeah. And if it doesn't pass, then it doesn't go to vote. If it does pass, they provide a conviction score. So different sections of the senior review are scored. And then that overall conviction score feeds into whether a project is voted up or down.
Okay, so it's an IRB Web3. Okay.
Similar to that, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I can provide some links to previous proposals as well, just so you can see how it's kind of structured. So.
And what the other thing, one question on top of that is what's the purpose of the VitaDAO in terms of, okay, so you're investing in longevity, but is there an overriding who controls it, or is it purely an oligarchy, or is it a democracy? Or because I know these things have great intentions, but it's like what happens to these sort of situations? It's like who controls it? So if you're raising money and it's reinvested, sometimes people can have radical ideas. I mean, like if you, for every year that you have your period, you live 2.2 years longer. That's the fact. But how many people know that, right? And what's the point? And these things matter, and the quality of life and the knock-on effects. How do you determine it? Can you revisit it? Can you grow it? Can you apply people to the team if there's a small group of people and they need help because there's only 2 or 3 people working it, and they need 3 or 4 extra people, and they need a team, or they need some statistician or something? Is that what you provide as well?
So, I mean, honestly, I have to say, VitaDAO has only been around since 2021, and a lot of the questions that you presented, I expect will definitely come up downstream, some of which have come up previously. And we're basically a organization which is a startup within a startup. So Decentralized Science is a startup in itself, and VitaDAO is basically a startup. So what the point I'm trying to make is that we don't have all the answers. However, very open to listening to the feedback of the communities to whether something is working, whether something is not working, whether somebody needs to be hired, whether somebody who joined the community who has been contributing for a while should be given more ownership. It's quite liquid in a way as to how it functions. The jury's still out, honestly, as to whether it's going to be impactful or not. So one of our strategic contributors and core members, Mike Brown from Pfizer's mentioned, it's going to be 2026, 2028 when the rubber hits the road, and you kind of look as to whether impact is being made. However, now it's the early stages of building and getting it right. And the great thing about VitaDAO and DAOs in general is that we have a big flourishing community of people who come mission aligned, not necessarily for payment either. It's because it's interesting to them, because it's doing something which is tackling scientific research funding, also building awareness under an umbrella. And it's basically a servant leader organization for researchers in longevity science, gerontology, and it's kind of looking at this differently and could potentially be a disruptor. Maybe not, but it's basically a different way of looking at how it's done.
No, I just think it's interesting when you have a director of Pfizer who's involved. I mean, that's sort of, is that poacher turned gamekeeper? I don't know. You know what I mean? It's like, but it's very interesting to hear and fascinating.
We actually have a question along these lines from David Wood, who wonders, what is the motivation of a pharma company like Pfizer to invest in VitaDAO?
Okay. So, I mean, I can speak from my experience. Obviously, I don't speak on behalf of Pfizer. And so the interest is kind of seeing curiosity, I guess. So what is happening in decentralized science in terms of how can we build as a more innovative a more innovative organization. And also longevity is one of those aspects which is quite overlooked, but also goes into areas such as cellular senescence or oncology, vaccine technology, which they also are focused on the venture side. So actually, Mike Brown gave a really interesting podcast a couple of months ago, maybe back in 2022, actually, where he actually speaks about his motivations to join VitaDAO and why it's a potential disruptor, or just something which is interesting to keep an eye on in the space, not just because of the types of innovations that we're looking at, but the way in which scientific research is done, and the fact that we're seeing such a Cambrian explosion of DeSci DAOs and organizations. And it's not just enthusiasts, but it's also like world-leading researchers who are showing interest in the space. And the way in which the evaluation due diligence is done via the collective hive mind is a super interesting way of looking at the way in which a traditional venture model makes decisions. And, you know, again, it's the jury's still out as to whether this is whether it's going to work. However, we're doing our best, and also I think, interest for Pfizer. Also, we're not competitors to Pfizer, not by any means, more collaborators. So having guidance, having access to a network of, the network that a Big Pharma has, also to be able to understand what we're catering towards, that farmers are also looking at, basically in the interests of making VitaDAO a successful venture. And does that answer your question?
Yes, I think this is helpful. And I also wanted to revisit the concept of quadratic voting. So David Wood writes, quadratic suggests squaring, that is, someone with 4 times as many tokens would have 16 times as much influence, but David says his guess is that the square root would be used rather than a square, so the first person in that case would only have twice as much influence. And I looked up quadratic voting on Wikipedia, and my understanding is essentially if somebody has multiple tokens, then the amount of voting power that they use increases essentially proportionally to the square of the number of tokens that they dedicate toward that vote. So essentially, if you choose to use 2 of your tokens to vote in favor of something, then a voting power in the amount of 4 gets used. If you choose to dedicate like 3 votes, then a voting power in the amount of 9 gets used, and so forth. So if you own 50% of the tokens, you don't get 50% of the votes. You get a much smaller proportion of the votes because the amount of voting power you're using just increases dramatically the more votes you dedicate toward that particular issue.
Exactly. And I've also just shared a link about quadratic funding. I wasn't able to find it earlier, but this is a really straightforward layman's way of looking at how quadratic funding works and how it's implemented.
Yes, and this link is going to be shared with our audience. Here it is. So please feel free to check it out if you're interested in learning more. Now, I'm glad we've explored this concept. And of course, the questions regarding governance are fascinating to me. I think back to Aristotle's Politics, and Aristotle outlined that there are really 3 basic types of governance systems. You have a monarchy, an aristocracy, or a democracy. And I'm not attaching any sorts of normative value statements to either of them, because Aristotle's point is that each of them has advantages and disadvantages. Each of them has ways in which it's able to accomplish some objectives to a better extent, and it also has failure points. But it seems to me that various organizations can have elements of these, and VitaDAO, per your statements, essentially has yet to arrive at the balance of these elements that it would choose to utilize in the long term. That is, it's experimenting with how much of each element would be, let's say, utilized in decision making and to what extent. So in this case, the democratic element would be the token holders and the voting that is performed. The aristocracy, so to speak, would be the stewards, and the monarchy would be Vitalik if he chose to essentially decide matters on his own unilaterally and use his influence in that way. We have something similar in the US Transhumanist Party. Honestly, the monarchical element would be myself as the chairman. The aristocratic element would be our officers, and the democratic element would be our members who vote on various aspects of our platform or our constitution or endorsing our candidates. And again, it's a choice of how heavily we emphasize one of these elements as compared to the others. And sometimes a different balance is appropriate for different stages in the organization's existence. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts in response to that kind of framework.
So, yeah, in terms of DAO governance, basically, not every DAO is the same. And there are also DAO tooling systems that deal with governance. Like, this is the level of detail that it's gone into. I mean, it does replicate the consensus building of a political party. However, it's basically specific to the subject matter that it deals with. In terms of decentralized science, governance is kind of seen as really key, especially when it's funding, making funding decisions. However, I do also think that the way in which governance is done, although now it works well, could be done better. And so be very open to listening to any types of other governance mechanisms or suggestions based on what has been seen at VitaDAO. As I mentioned, we are a startup organization operating in a field that is similar to a startup. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Well, it's a kind of evolving answer, I suppose. Now, Zach has a question that is much more specific. He wonders, is the NFT, and I think he's referring to the IP NFTs, on an ERC20 platform?
So off the top of my head, I'm not entirely sure as to whether it's ERC20. So the token is ERC20. As for the IP NFT, I'm not entirely sure. So I have an inkling that I don't want to be speaking to any misinformation. However, there is a really good README done by Molecule, which I will be sharing in the internal chat. Please feel free to share this with the audience as well. And this speaks to the technicalities of the IP NFT. We are on the Ethereum chain though.
Okay, no,
Yes.
the reason I ask is just, I know a little bit about NFTs, not very much, nothing like you do, of course, but I mean, I think it's the stealth product that will actually come out on top, or whatever it's going to be called, digital watermarking, whatever you want to call it. But so I'm actually a believer in it within a degree. Obviously, there's a governance issue and obviously the abuse of power issue, which unfortunately that happens by nature and default. But it's I'll talk on offline chat, I think, about this. But in terms of structuring, like, I NFT'd my DNA. I'm not putting on 23andMe. No way. I mean, you know, why should I? Who knows what's in there? You know, we should do that. It should be something we should be shown and talked about. How the fact that, you know, your value is you're putting data out everywhere. Well, that data that you have inside, and obviously there's a lot of very smart people on this channel and stuff. But there's lots of people who walk down the street who might not be smart, but they are smart because they come up with some genius idea and they need to understand how to do that. And I think that would be a really cool thing for you guys to not necessarily give people fish, but showing them how to fish and saying, hey, bang. And that would really, I think, certainly for us, you talk about monarchists and democracies, and well, we also need rebels and rebellions, right? We need to have rebellions, otherwise you can't have that. So I'm for the rebellion. So, you know, that's important to show those things to people. And I think what you're doing is great, by the way. I don't know a lot about it, but it's certainly the way to go through it, decentralized and not having. But the issue again with IRBs is you come up with an idea that you don't have, say, the qualifications for on paper, and then you're judged by your peers who are like, wait a minute, why didn't I think of this? Now I'm going to give this guy the cash. Forget it. That's what happens, right? So you have to almost get people outside of the field that will see the greater good for longevity. Like a Pfizer guy is going to want to make money by selling you products. But if we're designing a system that you don't need products to sell, so it's an upfront cost with a life cycle cost that is 40% lower, that's not good for the capitalist model. So how do you overcome that? I'm not saying I don't expect the answer. I'm just throwing that out there. I'm just saying. I'll shut up now, but that's it.
No, but I think you've touched on a really important point, and it also is a part of the fundamentals as to how decentralized science came about, and also just the general frustration which is expressed within the scientific community. And so you spoke about 23andMe and like, what are you doing with my data? And actually, another reason as to why I'm really excited about the blockchain technology, not the crypto like Ponzi hype per se, but also the technology behind it. So proof of transaction, for instance, and the address, the transaction hash. How about this is used for the use of data? So, I mean, there are discussions which are ongoing as to how this could be implemented on a wider scale healthcare system. But what if so patient data records had an audit trail, almost like a transaction hash as to what it's being used for? What if it could be packaged that way so that those who own their own data actually get visibility as to how that's being used? Of course, it could be quite controversial, I think, for those who don't necessarily want to see that, but also we're kind of seeing an emergence of the creator economy through Web3, and in that, scientific researchers, those who do innovation, are the most unsung creators of them all. So,
yes.
Again, like let's have the discussion. Like let's look into how this could be used on a more widespread scale.
Just in answer to that, well, what we do with because what we do is not, so we say the FDA don't like it, it's not, it's great for society, but it's not great for the people that fund certain things. And that's another question, and we're talking about it here. But for instance, if we could show you a way that you're going to live to 120 with the physicality of a fit 35-year-old, would you take that? Hey, I would, right? So, but unfortunately, we're not going to be selling you drugs every 5 weeks. So those sort of things change. And I think when people realize your value is your data, I mean, I don't know what you've obviously got an English accent, but I don't know what your ethnicity is, but you're probably Scandinavian, right? Of extraction. So the reality is you have probably a much higher resistance to HIV. Well, why is that? It's because of something that happened centuries ago. And that could be of value in going forward, not saying that thing per se, but something like that. And these should be, there are values everywhere in nature. And maybe that little village in the Amazon has something that is totally unique for the world. And it shouldn't be allowed that Joe Schmo from Pfizer can come and take that. And we should give it to them and give them the ability, just, hey, you can register it. And then if it happens, it's almost like putting down a little trust fund for your kid. And then, it's that kind of thing. I'm just saying that's something that would be, again, offline, but yeah, I agree with what you're saying.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I also think, though, that Big Pharma really does play a big role in terms of getting drugs into the market and basically going from early stage clinical trials into reaching patients. And I like to think that people act with the best intentions. But I mean, Big Pharma has the capital, it has the network, it has, everything under the umbrella. So again, like VitaDAO isn't a competitor, and we're also not looking to kind of knock them off their axis either. It's more of a collaborative model. But going back to what you mentioned, or what you're talking about, Zach, we're basically looking at a more of a systemic issue in terms of how it's all done, where the incentives are, how, you know, how patient data is used, how it basically works from in the laboratory to reaching patients, to who's funding it, who's profiting from it, the use of patient data. And that's also really what the decentralized science movement is talking about. It's basically kind of reigniting the discussion and looking at the technology of Web3 and blockchain as to how we can actually do something about this, or at least like get the conversation going. This time, you know, like with the utility of new novel technologies with internet native communities and being able to unite people in a way that hasn't really been done before. So again, it's really, really early on, but I'm very much looking forward to where we will be in 3-4 years' time.
I think it's not that early on. I think 2 years is a long time. I think you've been around a long time. There's a lot further down the line than people realize. And I think, you know, it's almost like people can come up. What's the great thing is someone can come up with an idea and get it implemented, even though they might not have the traditional track record of a PhD from Harvard or whatever. I don't know, whatever. You know what I'm saying? That would be wonderful. And I think it's almost that there was a very brief period where the world is sort of sandwiched close so that the world's got a very flat structure for a brief period of time before it goes back to the haves and have-nots. And we're just in that transitional process like we were in 45 or 1815 or whatever it is, you know. So it's very interesting. Very interesting.
Yes, indeed. So Art Ramon made an interesting observation that the NFT can be used to authorize access to genomic data stored with some entity to a third party. And Art Ramon, I'd be happy to have you elaborate on that. But it seems to me the idea is that people would own their own genomic data using this IFT, and they would be able to selectively disclose or not disclose the data to third parties by means of the NFT in some manner. Is that what you meant via that comment?
Yes, that's how I understand it. That would be a way to basically sell your data to some third party. So you would own your data and be compensated anytime you share it with a third party. So yeah.
Eleanor, do you think that will be a realistic possibility sometime in the future? I don't know if VitaDAO would do it, but do you think the functionality to do that exists?
I think the functionality to do that does exist. So if you've ever come across GenomesDAO and Data Lake, they're doing something which is basically tackling that specifically. And in terms of implementation, again, the jury is still out. There may be parties who may not be so willing, you know, to have that implemented. I think, again, it's a question of incentives, alignment, and ensuring that patients who have authority, well, patients who allow their data to be used are either incentivized or have a say. And those who use the genomic data are also willing to disclose how and why it's done. Again, it's not exactly my wheelhouse, but GenomesDAO and Data Lake are also, DeSci organizations that are looking at this.
All right, thank you. And we have a comment from our friend John H., who writes, protecting intellectual property has always been a challenge. And I think the IP NFT piece of your presentation has sparked considerable discussion, some differences of opinion. So I'll bring up the comment from David Wood, who says that the NFT part of the presentation was the least convincing, but he wonders, could VitaDAO continue to meet its ambitions if it stopped referring to NFTs? You may recall, Eleanor, our conversation in Dublin, where I was asking some questions about the NFTs and essentially what would happen if you split up the ownership of the intellectual property among various holders of these NFTs, and then there's a difference of opinion in terms of how that intellectual property is to be approached. So for instance, some of the holders may want to be more forgiving, and if somebody technically infringes on the intellectual property, but the infringement is perceived to be benign or not a sufficient threat, those holders might choose to let it go. But then some other holders might say, no, we want to aggressively pursue any sort of infringement. And if you have a single IP holder, that entity gets to make that decision one way or the other. But if you have multiple stakeholders, how does that get resolved, for instance? And I wonder if that's what the root of David Wood's concern is, or if he has a different concern. But David, please elaborate in the chat if you have more to say on this. But Eleanor, I'm curious, perhaps if you could share with the audience what you told me in response to my questions.
Sure. So basically, the role of the IP NFT is, first off, in order to raise non-dilutive funding for a scientific project, and it's also much faster than the traditional grant funding route. So Dr. Kowalczyk's project, I'll speak about in particular. So the time taken from application to funding was 4 weeks. Traditionally, it takes several months. And so how the IP NFT actual governance works is that, so first off, there's a IP NFT minting ceremony. So this is where the sponsored development or sponsored research agreement is minted on chain. So it has the shell, let's say, of the basically what will be filled with the data generated, right? And so the funding amount basically is transferred to the scientists. They do their experiments and they meet their milestones, and the data that is generated fills this IP NFT. So just for full disclosure as well, this IP NFT is a digital representation that says, yes, through the blockchain transaction OX whatever, this states that the IP is inside this NFT, and this is like a yes, like an I as to the milestones having been reached, and etc. So how it works after that is basically a way in order to raise non-dilutive funding prior to the need to set up a company and raise institutional capital. The IP NFT is fractionalized into, let's say, for argument's sake, 100 tokens, IPTs, which represent the full IP NFT. A percentage of this, so for instance, between 10 and 50% goes towards the researchers, and maybe a 2% of that pool is reserved for a crowd sale. And so, as we saw with the VitaFast Kowalczyk crowd sale, it was 17,000% oversubscribed. So there's a price which is set for that token, and through this, through these proceeds made, so I believe 30,000 was raised, and this basically enables the scientists to use this funding in order to further their projects, also, and basically meet their next milestones. Also, IPTs, maybe 5% of the IPTs is used for bounties for more risk tolerant stakeholders in the scientific ecosystem. So you may want to pay, say, 100 VitaFast for services of a bioinformatician. Again, you're not touching the treasury you're not giving away IP per se, you're giving away a smaller number of tokens than the controlling amount, which is via the researchers and also VitaDAO. And there's also a number of tokens which are left unminted, therefore inaccessible, in order to use for any other governance. And those who own the IPTs can govern, i.e. make decisions, as you would do with VitaDAO, for any types of proposals. There's a project lead, i.e. a company builder, that works with the project team and presents a report, almost similar to an investment community. And these are done at a specific cadence, but it also functions to show the community as to what's being done. Of course, privacy and GDPR, everything that falls under that umbrella is completely taken into account. And basically, the IPTs are used as a way to further the project, decentralize governance, engage more of the scientific ecosystem through community, i.e. networks, through to the next stage. By which time the project is hopefully de-risked to the point where by the time institutional capital comes in, there's more equity that's left on the table. And the buyer, let's say, of the IP, they have a drag-along clause right, which basically means that token holders have to sell back their tokens in order for the farmer or whichever acquiring company to acquire that IP, and therefore those IP tokens are taken off the market.
So interesting. These IP tokens are essentially a transitional funding mechanism, but ultimately if the IP gets acquired by, let's say, a conventional player, there is an automatic sale clause essentially built into the contract. Very interesting. Now, David Wood did respond with an elaboration of his concern, and here's what he writes. He writes, "My concern is that whereas 95% of the blockchain is dubious solutions that claim to rely on blockchains can almost always get the job done better without the blockchain, and that percentage of so-called unreliable claims rises to 99% or higher for NFTs, he thinks surely there are ways of doing fractional ownership without the mechanism of NFTs. I think he's referring to a kind of wave of attempted tokenization that we saw during various crypto bubbles where fairly mundane services were tokenized without an apparent use case for doing that. That is to say, you could have done the exact same thing without the token, or a lot of uses of NFTs seem to be somewhat redundant. If you think of digital artworks, I have often wondered, well, why does one need to introduce this kind of artificial scarcity to images that can be freely reproduced and shared as they are? Isn't there a different way that could potentially reward artists, like initial bounties for their creation, which is really called the patronage system, which existed for centuries? So I think David is wondering, is there a way to accomplish the same thing without using NFTs in VitaDAO's case?
I like that question, actually, and it also makes me think, what other mechanisms are you aware of which could be complementary to VitaDAO's funding building model? So the reason why tokens is interesting is because that it enables governance and ownership of the community, of the DAO, and it is decentralized. It is global, community-led. The way in which decisions are made are via tokens, and so far, in order to do something like that on a global level and keep things, I guess, coordinated, operationalized, has been quite difficult. And having a token in order to create decisions is really something which is inherent with the the Web3 model. Of course, there's also the open science movement as well, which kind of sparked the whole thing off. But personally, I'm quite excited as to what the functionality of NFTs and the token component of the NFTs, also the open collaborative way of looking at bringing IP or representation of IP, community governed and led internet native projects could bring to the table. And also another point to bring in mind is the fact that, of course, during the crypto summer, there's a huge bull run and lots of Ponzi projects, lots of unnecessary token launches. However, we are in the builders market, especially last year. This year, we're kind of slowly but surely getting out of the builders of the bear market. But these projects have stuck around and are also demonstrating utility to a community of many people. And it's almost as though we kind of we've ridden through the initial part of the gardener hype cycle, and now we're kind of going onto the curve of sustainability side. So now we're starting to really see the utility. But again, so I mean, we also collaborate with grants funding bodies such as Impetus Grants. We also do Longevity Prize. Gitcoin is another one, and of course, which I've mentioned. And again, so the idea is to collaborate. We also, scientists who are in the who've been funded by VitaDAO are also applying to NIH grants as well, or UKRI grants. So it's basically another way of looking at funding, building via the globally distributed component, and opening up for more access to funding.
Yes, thank you for that response. And I thought it was interesting that you used the term builder's market to refer to the bear market. It seems that that reference suggests that the entities that stay in this market and continue to be active are the ones that build something of substance, as opposed to the ones that want to make a quick buck, essentially. So I like that characterization.
Yeah, I don't know if it's a Web3 term that's been thrown around quite a lot, but definitely it has been a builder's market. And so I mean, VitaDAO and LabDAO, my previous organization, were both able to raise during those markets, and so it's we're demonstrating value and utility, and intend to carry on doing so.
Yes, indeed. And Zach has an interesting comment. He thinks that a way to describe NFTs is to call them digital watermarked products with full provenance. Do you like that characterization?
I do like that characterization, because I think that there's the term NFT and tokens and crypto is so loaded by now, and actually talking about these things and also talking about the actual value and utility, it's almost distracted by the initial terminology of NFT. So I think the digital watermark products with full provenance is a really good way actually to reframe it. Maybe something a little bit shorter so that it doesn't sound like it's a euphemism for NFT, but I really like the way of thinking that.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. Well, thank you for that response. And here's another tough question. We're getting some tough questions today, but this relates to the provenance of the builders market that we are currently in. And Jason wonders, since Sam Bankman-Fried and the FTX debacle, how do you reassure new members that VitaDAO isn't a pump and dump scheme? And he says he knows it's not, but for a lot of people, it's just a complicated situation. And Jason, if you'd like to elaborate on that question at all, feel free.
That was pretty much it. My other question, besides that, would be because I've been a member of VitaDAO for quite a while now, and sort of been just like, I don't know, not active. Where would be like the newbie room? Like if I wanted to come back and just sort of smooth back in, where would we go? Discord server, or something like that. But that's it.
Yeah, no.
Sorry. It's just that since everybody got burned, with the Sam Bankman-Fried thing, and it's just got really bad taste. And how would we simplify it for people? To somebody that doesn't really know about what an NFT is and all this stuff. I mean, we had Cryonauts on, and that was before all this other stuff happened, and we're all just kind of learning as we're going, and I'm just wondering, how would you reassure somebody that's new? And that's it.
Yeah, I hear you.
Go ahead.
Yeah. I think, it is a big concern, and probably one of the largest concerns and largest barriers to friction in terms of getting encouraging anybody to be a part of the mission and join the Discord. So first point is, as I alluded to just earlier, we've been around since 2021. We've been through the builders market, the Ponzi scheme. We've managed to raise a second round and about to go into our next round. We've actually done stuff. We have, we've shipped, we've executed, and have things to talk about. So in one of my slides, I spoke to the fact that we funded 19 projects, and we actually were featured on the Bowtied Biotech Longevity Investors Report for having funded quite a large number of projects in the longevity space. We were also featured by the World Economic Forum for one of the most, alongside Gitcoin as well, actually, for one of the most prominent impact DAOs in the space, and just the interest as well as to what it is that we're doing, how we're doing it differently. So those are 2 points that I would kind of bring to the table. Also, sure, pump and dump does happen, but you also see that on the stock market. And, that's also, every industry has its shortfalls, and crypto, sadly, has also, in the very early days has been, it's seen a lot of weird stuff. I don't know if I can swear on this channel, but, it's seen some weird stuff. And the thing is, though, is that you also get this in other industries as well. So I look at it in the same way as you would, like, with the HMV Reddit, organized pump and dump thing that was done back in lockdown, and that's on a regulated stock market. Another thing that I would suggest is that anyone who's interested in joining the Discord, talk to a person who is also in VitaDAO, talk to one of the stewards. So I lead the onboarding calls for Dealflow. I walk newcomers through how Dealflow works and what all the terminology means. I think also demystifying the Web3 terminology is a really big one, and also actually having a real world comparison. So as Zach mentioned, like NFT is a digital watermark product with full provenance, or a digital replica of a royalty sharing agreement, or a sponsored research agreement. There are different ways of framing it. And most importantly, it's talking about the mission and what VitaDAO stands for, not necessarily the token. The token is a governance token. It's used in order to make decisions. It's, we don't there's a treasury that we use in order to deploy funds for projects, not the actual value of the token. So there's that. I hope that reassures you to some extent, and that you're encouraged to come to another conference.
No, that's a really good answer. You know, it's a governance token, and then it's not necessarily the same model as some of these other, you know, monkey pictures and stuff. you know, so that's good. Good answer.
Yes. No monkeying around at VitaDAO. But I also wanted to bring in kind of the monarchical element of this whole picture, and that is Vitalik Buterin, who is a very different individual from Sam Bankman-Fried. If you just consider their personalities and the fact that Vitalik has never seemed to care about ostentatious displays of wealth. He seems to live essentially an ascetic lifestyle, and he has utilized his fortune to support longevity research among other causes, but he seems to do it in a purely mission-oriented way. And to me, that is a marker of trust. And sometimes you have to have trust in the people behind a particular organization. And I'm sure we could say the same for Eleanor and other stewards at VitaDAO. I've interacted a bit with Max Unfried, for instance, and I think he's a trustworthy individual as well. And one I do not think can get away from looking at individuals and their motivations to some extent. Even if you have a decentralized autonomous organization, you have to have people involved and you have to have some element of trust. The first decentralized autonomous organization, which was just called the DAO, essentially failed because the autonomous set of algorithms couldn't anticipate a certain vulnerability. So humans are there to try to prevent that. It's the whole human in the loop argument, why we need that with AI, why we need that with any institutional arrangements.
Exactly, fully agree. And I think it is really about connecting with people in the DAO and not just seeing it as a lot of comments, opinions, whatnot. We're all people. And I actually think that, so another unique thing that VitaDAO is doing is bridging the virtual, the Discord server side, which is kind of where we're based. It's like a Web3 Slack, if you will. But we're also bridging that with the in-person events. So we started doing an ambassadors program. So those who are interested in VitaDAO and want to meet people, set up small events, talks to talk about longevity. And it's important to, the VitaDAO mission, and also just to get the discussion going on a globally distributed level, really just to kind of amp this up a little bit. And it's building that interpersonal connection that we're really lacking, especially since the progression of the digital age. We're becoming more and more internalized, if I may, with the role of electronics like social media. And I like to think that the emergence of DAOs and also the internet native communities is really a product of lockdown and being socially disparate. And DAOs like VitaDAO are internet native communities where people are coming together with the same cause, making friends online who have similar interests, similar passions. And now we're kind of bridging that between not only the internet side, but also the in-person side. So it's something which is really valuable socially that we're doing too.
Yes, indeed. And actually, this is a good bridge to another area that I was curious about, which is your Discord server and how you manage it, especially to, say, prevent Discord on the Discord server. How do you structure the interactions or facilitate the interactions so that they are all constructive and contribute to the mission of VitaDAO, and it's not just a bunch of individuals kind of going all over the place or sometimes being at loggerheads.
I really like that that pun, Discord not turning into Discord. And I have a similar analogy where DAOs without good operation is like Lord of the Flies, but online. So, you know, actually, I had to credit the community and awareness steward, Alex Dobrin, for the operations and coordination for the Discord server, because you really have to be pretty forward thinking as to what's being discussed. Like, what are the main channels? What are the threads? What are the if-then clauses for creating a new thread or creating a new channel? And I have to say, it's still not perfect. We're still iterating, but iteration, feedback, and yeah, continuous building is key. So currently, the working groups are set out into different channels. And there are sub-channels within those channels, which point to initiatives. So in the deal flow instance, there's the deal flow main channel, and then there's also, for instance, I'm just trying to think off the top of my head, the Builder Squad, and then the Vita Tech, which is another initiative which is being built, and there are also threads, so sub-threads for smaller initiatives. For instance, each deal has its own thread, or each sub-conversation, which might clutter the main channel in terms of hygiene, is put into another thread. And then you have the option to switch off notifications for each specific thread. Let me know if I'm getting a little bit too technical in the weeds here. Also an operator at heart, but I think online, like hygiene for online communication is definitely key, especially when you're wanting to create something which is self-automated and also build context.
Yes, and I appreciate that answer, because often the way one structures a venue will essentially contribute greatly to the nature and quality of the interactions in that venue. And Jason has experience with managing our Discord. He put a comment in our private chat, so maybe we could learn some techniques from VitaDAO here. Now, I also wanted to highlight a question from Daniel Tweed, and part of this question is readily answerable. He asks, does the Vita token have USD resale value? And yes, it does. I found the exchange rate right now. It's about $1.86 per Vita token, which is affordable if somebody wanted to just dabble in VitaDAO. One could purchase a few of these tokens. Hopefully there wouldn't be like outrageous gas fees or anything like that for the transaction. I know sometimes that can be an issue, but his other question is one that may be more generally applicable to any project that utilizes tokens, and that is, how do you avoid running afoul of SEC regulations?
Yeah, absolutely. And so to answer the first part of the question, yes, the Vita token does have USD resale value. You can purchase Vita. There's also a page on the VitaDAO website. However, if, basically, please read the white paper, please read any documentation before deciding to purchase any Vita. Again, it's used as a governance token. So in terms of running afoul of SEC regulations, we have a lot of internal legal representation who have, so we consult tier 1 law firms, our service provider Molecule, who also does the IP NFT infrastructure, has a in-house legal team who specialize in IP law. And we also have legal contributors in the VitaDAO community. And so anything token related relating to Vita or strategic contributors is meticulously vetted, speaking from experience, before that's put out into the ether. And white papers as well are reviewed, iterated. There's a lot of time and effort as well that goes into reviewing and making sure that it's compliant with regulation, for example, MiCA, which will be implemented by next year. And in terms of SEC, so we do not operate in US jurisdictions, and we're basically kind of wanting to, we're playing ball with the SEC, and again, we are doing our utmost to be legally compliant and diligent. So does that answer your question?
I think so. Good answer. And I do think that this is most certainly an evolving area, but personally, I am fond of jurisdictional and institutional experimentation. And in the US Transhumanist Party, we support experiments in governance, including micronations or like special economic zones. And it seems that VitaDAO is trying to be an experiment in governance, in particular with regard to the decentralized funding of longevity research. So for me, that is an important experiment to undertake. Now, our friend John H. makes certain observations about pharmaceutical companies, which are still the predominant players in the medical arena. And first, he characterizes them as essentially trying to acquire anything that proves to be a moneymaker. So initially, they may not be as interested in a longevity research approach, but once they can see evidence that it is a moneymaker, they would try to acquire it. He also notes that half of the ads on American TV are for drugs, and he says the 40% of the other half, 40% of the total would be for insurance, and the remaining 10% is for everything else. I'm not sure what the proportions actually are, but I do sometimes get a little bit irritated seeing contemporary pharmaceutical company ads where essentially the predominant model is happy, smiling seniors on a beach somewhere, apparently enjoying their lives while the narrator drones on in a monotone way about all of the possible side effects of the medication, including death. And this seems to be the contemporary paradigm, which is not really appealing to a longevity enthusiast, because at least when I see these ads, they're kind of self-defeating. It's like, is that the best that you can get from their product? And oh, they do want to bring us to recognize the side effects, including death. So longevity, as our community conceives of it, would be a radical paradigm shift from that kind of model. Do you think it's feasible to bring Big Pharma along for that paradigm shift, or do you think there needs to be a wholesale change in the institutional structures that are used to actually facilitate these longevity breakthroughs?
That's a tricky question, and also I don't want to be speaking on behalf of Big Pharma as well, but I think that everyone has their own opinions as to how we ought to tackle longevity, and also what the actual definition is of longevity and how that ought to be managed across stakeholders as well. So as I mentioned earlier, I see Big Pharma as playing a pretty big role in terms of bringing overlooked, under-researched aspects of longevity research, specifically looking at the hallmarks of aging and research that is traditionally too high risk profile. I see Big Pharma as playing a role in terms of getting this research out of the laboratory. So individuals from Pfizer who are in the community being able to help support projects from their infancy the valley of death, if I may, into basically setting up a company and growing from there. So I really see the utility with helping companies through this high value but also extremely high risk stage. So I think that they're good in that aspect. As for the part that John mentioned, the seniors, the drug adverts, the monotone voice, explaining all the disclaimers. As a Brit, I can't actually say I've experienced this too much, but I think another component of longevity, which actually doesn't concern big pharma too much, is actually the education side and the prevention of any type of age-related disease. So I think in enabling access to resources and just generating awareness as well, which is also, I mean, is fundamental. And this is also something which a model like a DAO, which is community first, can also look at, because you are able to, as a community member, start initiatives. We're also rolling out a membership services program where community members can get access to, when it's been implemented, educational materials for personal longevity, recommendations for personal interventions. So there are different ways of looking at it, and of course, Big Pharma does play a role, but it is also a really fundamental aspect of the drug development value chain. There are also more, more personal interventions that you can take as an individual that doesn't necessarily concern Big Pharma. And hopefully you'd actually get to the point where you don't need to take any of these drugs which are being advocated for. And yeah, I mean, that's kind of where I stand. Is we need both.
Indeed. Well, thank you. And Zach writes in our internal chat that the gerontology community is about prevention and not band-aid cure, which is the remit of pharmaceutical companies. It's interesting that you are not bombarded by these advertisements so much in the UK, perhaps because of the National Health Service. The pharmaceutical companies do not feel like their business model relies on selling to the general public. So they would most likely try to sell their products through the governmental system instead. And so the public doesn't see the advertisements. Now, I've had my quibbles with national healthcare systems, but I would say that may be one of the most powerful arguments in their favor that I have heard. But John H. also writes that Big Pharma probably also has some of the best equipped and staffed laboratories in the world. Once on board, they could be very powerful allies indeed, but they'd want to run the show too. So this is the balancing act, I suppose. How do you invite them on as partners without sacrificing your autonomy as well as the mission that you seek to accomplish, which may not always fall within kind of the range of the moment calculations of the big pharma companies?
Yeah, I actually think that these, although difficult, they're very important topics that need to be discussed, especially when, considering the future of a DAO, which is actually gaining quite a lot of traction. So, I mean, again, we're still quite early and we have yet to actually go to that stage. However, the key aspect here is that if you do have a conflict of interest in terms of voting, then you're unable to vote. Also, governance decisions such as these are also created by the community. So that would be my short answer, I guess, to ensuring that farmers don't run the show. However, having them on board as collaborators with a growing community is really powerful. And it can maybe also change the discourse as to how science DAOs and big farmers work together.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. And Daniel, you have a question, so please go ahead.
Yeah, I was noticing how Gitcoin works. Is most of what they do is creating public digital goods infrastructure, but it seems like VitaDAO is following more of a closed source model where people can actually realize some investment returns after the IP becomes monetized down the road. Do you guys have any open source projects, or are they all basically kind of following the private IP monetization model?
So the IP itself is closed, and that's basically due to, kind of IP. But basically you can, the thing that's different is that the way in which the research is done, the company building is done, the rationale as well is more open source. That part is more collaborative. So you can actually go onto the VitaFast snapshot forum and look at proposals that have already been put out to the community for voting in the first VitaFast fractionalized project and see how this would look. So to go back to the point, the IP itself is closed. However, there is a on-chain representation of it being there, and it kind of is almost works as like a promise to shareholders. So it kind of functions in that way.
Yes. Do you guys also maybe have a way to look at existing open source data that's out there and maybe derive research from data points that haven't been looked at closely enough?
Yes, I mean, I've been giving this topic quite a bit of thought actually, but it's just more of a resources and bandwidth thing on a personal side. But I was thinking about could we create like a repository of IP that's been, or patents that are being published that concern the hallmarks of aging and basically what's out there, how long is it being on the shelf for, when's the patent going to expire, what's being done with it, can we reach out to the researchers, can we use ChatGPT-4 in order to generate some insights as to how we ought to, how we can build off this in the interest of longevity research. I mean, that's, I guess, pie in the sky ideas, and also would really appreciate some validation from other people in the community who've where this is kind of more their wheelhouse. But that's that's something which is kind of percolating.
Yeah, I know that in astronomy, if you hunt comets, for example, you can get a comet named after you. So there's kind of a bragging rights incentive, but I don't know if the same thing could happen in biotech. So thanks.
Quite an interesting discussion. So I wanted to ask you a question, Eleanor, before we get to closing comments from our panelists, and that is, could you tell us a bit about your journey toward becoming a steward with VitaDAO? What path did you take, and how did you end up in this position?
Yeah, so it's quite an unconventional path, actually. So I initially studied languages at university and had a lot of side projects. I had a lot of side interests, specifically in biotech and just reading scientific papers. I found them so interesting, kind of contrary to other interests that late teens, early 20s might have had, but I just found it really, really interesting. And so I basically went from studying languages, so I speak fluent German and French, and went from there to working in M&A advisory, and was basically, so another thing I found is that so the German market for biotech, especially concerning M&A mid-market transactions, there aren't very many German-speaking, British passport holding people, and really kind of carved out a niche for myself with the UK, US investment community, and also being able to have these sorts of interactions with the German biotech community. So was doing M&A advisory for healthcare and biotech. And then I transitioned from there to working in consulting. That was Marwood, as you mentioned in the beginning credits. So to say political, regulatory consultancy. And what they do is they advise the commercial impact basically between for political and regulatory change for large cap institutional investors in healthcare and biotech. And so basically during the time that I was at Marwood, so they have a very large US base, but the UK base is quite small. So there was a director vacancy, and I basically filled that from the position of an analyst and had a very, very fast trajectory of learning. I was not only doing the consulting work in German, but also leading the company growth. And we actually ended up doubled, outperforming our sales pipeline. We had a historic record of sales. And we had a really high period of growth during the time that I was in this role. So from there, and between there as well, I also co-founded a company, an AI-based recruitment. That was also a lockdown, a lockdown project that I can talk to in more detail offline. But from there, I ended up getting poached to work at ODX, which is on deck. So their Silicon Valley-based accelerator. Was working in fund operations there, so basically raising from LPs to deploying capital and managing companies, also interfacing with founders, and also working on some of the company building sides as well. And I transitioned from fund operations to becoming the founding chief operations officer at VitaDAO. We raised 3.6 million during a bear market. We're now generating revenue. And basically, they pivoted from doing a fund for computational biology to working on tools. And I made the move to working VitaDAO. My experience is more on the operational side of biotech, and also have a lot of I've done a lot of reading research on company building for biotech, and also the actual functionality of, for instance, the hallmarks of aging and its impact, on society at large. Can speak as well offline if anyone has any interest. But now I lead deal flow in the VitaDAO working group.
Yes, that's quite a fascinating journey from essentially a student of languages to being a steward with VitaDAO. And of course, it speaks to a great deal of intellectual versatility and a set of traits that we really try to highlight and bring out in people at the virtual Enlightenment salons, because we wish to cultivate essentially the formation of connections across disciplines, across different areas of human endeavor. So now we've come to a time in our salon where I would invite each of the panelists to either make a concluding comment or ask a final question of Eleanor. I am going to have a final question, but first let's hear from our other panelists, starting with Art Ramon Garcia.
Yeah, quick question. Does VitaDAO plan on doing anything with the copy that was airdropped on Richard Hart's post-chain blockchain?
I'm not too sure what that would be. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah, there was a creation of a new blockchain, and
Okay.
one of the unique things that Richard Hart did was everything that was on the ERC20 would be copied over, and there's essentially a copy of all the coins on post-chain, and some people are using them. Probably you wouldn't use it like you are using it now. You're on your ERC20 side, but possibly you could find a use for it. So that's all I had.
So that's actually something which isn't totally in my remit, and also probably something which happened before I was really full-time in VitaDAO. But in terms of tokens, I mean, the Vita token, which is on the Ethereum blockchain, is the only one which is being used at the moment. So any sort of replicas, I can imagine, would have been deprecated. Simply because I don't have so much information on that, please don't take that as gospel, and also do your own research. This is kind of what I've seen though since since I interact with the token pretty much every day.
All right, thank you.
All right, thank you. And let's go to Jason. Let's see.
Yeah, you're adorable. Just gotta say that you're adorable. And can we share the Discord server for VitaDAO? Can we, and then maybe like I could share it in the Transhumanist Party server. And one thing I kind of want to mention is one of the reasons why I really like Gennady and this whole Transhumanist Party thing that we're doing here, and that he's open to these new ideas of new governance, and that is very, very interesting to me, which I love what you guys are doing. We need to probably take a lot of tips from you, so if you have any advice to throw our way on e-governance, we are all ears, and I'm loving what you're doing, so thank you is all.
Thank you. I'm really glad to hear that. And I also think that having the benefit of learning from other communities, other industries, other disciplines is actually really supplementary, not only to one project in particular, but also to all. So I'm a strong advocate of kind of information exchange, knowledge sharing. That goes beyond your industry.
Yes, indeed. And thank you, Eleanor, for allowing us to share the Discord link as well. So anybody who wants to join the VitaDAO Discord, you may do so via this URL. Now let's go to Daniel.
Yeah, I'm very happy to be the newly minted community science director for the USTP. So I think the longevity topic is a great topic area to do community science within. And I really congratulate VitaDAO and the whole DeSci community, which is really an impressive community. I kind of have this pet project. You can see by my call sign that I'm an amateur radio licensed person, operator. And I think that community of 3 million plus off-grid communicators would be a great stewardship and curatorship community for community science. They already do some, which is kind of like looking at ionospheric effects during eclipses, and but they tend to be a pretty sedentary community. And, they would be a great test case to do like longevity experiments and data collection from. I'm thinking of gamifying things with, I don't know if you've heard of the POAP, or the Proof of Attendance Protocol token. It's, I'm thinking, hams kind of do that by sending each other these postcards that kind of are souvenirs from their stations. So I'm thinking that would be a neat model to do, kind of a non-monetized, community science, because it's amazing what people do for bragging rights, basically, or just, when you gamify something. So those would be my observations. And I also think the life insurance industry is a potential source of the $100 billion per year funding that we advocate for in our USTP platform section. I think it's CIV in Roman numerals. So it's amazing the kind of pushback you'll get from people, though. When you talk about longevity, they'll see it as some elitist hive mind kind of spooky, scary projects. But I think living people are way more contributing to society than corpses. So they don't seem to see that point. So those are just some observations. Any usage of the POAP or the Pope token for in longevity?
So for longevity, I mean, the POAP token can be used pretty widely, actually, not just in longevity, but across projects. So in terms of the utility of the POAP, it'd be interesting to look into what exactly it would be doing in the context of of the initiative. Maybe it's something that we could talk about offline, but I do see the utility as like a proof of something, and it's also really easy to set up as well.
Yeah. The inventor wants to keep it free forever. So that's a great mission, kind of like Bitcoin Pizza Day or something. So.
Indeed. And Daniel was referring to section 104 of our U.S. Transhumanist Party platform, and this is the relevant excerpt. The United States Transhumanist Party advocates for a permanent annual $100 billion funding package for anti-aging research to be immediately distributed to leading research organizations in the field, which have in the past specifically identified the defeat and reversal of biological aging as their goals. We originally advocated this as a response to COVID-19 because of the insight that COVID predominantly afflicts the elderly people who have suffered from the damage of biological aging. But even as a more general goal, COVID notwithstanding, this $100 billion annual funding package will go a long way. So now let's go to Zach for his final comment or question.
I have a load of questions, and they will take too long. So thank you very much, Eleanor, for your time. Really appreciate that. I'd love to talk about some other things offline, which are much more detailed. But it would the road to hell. I would just say this: there's a few things. One in the longevity community is that people are so afraid of dying they don't know how to live. So sometimes you've got to think about living, not dying, rather. And the second thing is that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And so yes, it's all great and it's wonderful, but it's like having it's like, do you trust an anorexic chef? There's all these things like that. It's like there's so many things that some of the things you say that do concern me, and as I said offline, I could talk about those, but things like having the interest of these large pharmaceuticals, you don't put a fox in the hen house. And number one. And the other thing as well is, again, being from Britain, you don't have advertising there, and obviously I understand that, but there's other issues that happen with the NHS, and there was the other ones as well in Europe. And last point as well is that I do believe that if we can show life cycle cost, not cost of production and cost of maintenance, so that, hey, you know what, if we look at the life cycle, we look at a human being or a societal impact. So for instance, if you have a longevity issue, one of the three key areas of longevity of the super ageist people of the blue zones is not their diet, is not even all what they eat. That's all BS. It's actually regular moderate exercise. They believe in a higher power, and they have an active social life. So these plays to who we are, what we're designed for. We're fundamentally cavemen or women or cave people that now have 10,000 years of society, but we evolve over centuries. And so I think that is very, very important, millennia rather, sorry. And so that obviously has an impact. And I think we have to accept what we are first before we even try and go to the next stage. Because, and that's something that requires saying, hey, I don't want a 36 month ROI on a 15% margin and blah, 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 blah. Actually, what I really want to do is I'm prepared to put this down for my grandchildren. And that takes a very changing concept, because we have a Malthusian concept of everything is more. Well, we've hit that peak. It's done, over. over finished. So let's accept that and move forward. And what we do isn't going to benefit us per se, but it will benefit our children. And if we look at that point of view of a bit more selflessness, which is easier said than done. It's not, people are greedy. It's just human nature. And I don't know how you can answer that question. And again, I think what you're doing is great, but we'll see.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, really interesting observations. And yeah, it's fundamental to bring this into the discussion. And you know, it's not like there's a solve all thing. You know, it's just kind of also adding to the adding another layer to what's already going on. But I agree, there are a number of systemic issues that need to be tackled, and you know, it needs to be more of a collaborative, or yeah, just kind of needs rethinking basically. But it's on a more systemic level. But yeah, again, a lot of interesting topics and points for debate as well. But again, we're about to close, so yeah.
Yes, indeed. So in closing, I think my question dovetails a bit with what Zach was saying, because you have experience analyzing policy and regulation. So if you could combine that with your experience with decentralized science and speak to some of the implications for policy and regulation that decentralized science initiatives have brought, what do you think is the best way for policymakers to approach these? Would it be laissez-faire, let them happen the way they happen? Do you think there is some sort of way that these systems could be encouraged or incentivized? And if so, what would those ways be?
Yeah, so in terms of policymakers and regulators, of course, we are operating in a gray zone, but also something which I'm seeing is quite, especially in the UK as well, which is quite amenable to the rate of acceleration that companies in crypto and blockchain technology are working in. And so I see at the moment, so I mean, speaking with relation to the UK and the EU, so we're starting to see the tightening up of regulations, such as the MiCA being implemented by next year, but actually working on some of the white papers that are that will be MiCA compliant. There's a lot of let's say safeguarding and tightening up with relation to the anonymity front. So basically, if you to do anything Ponzi scheme-esque, there's no longer the ability to kind of hide behind a pseudonym. Like your identity is published in that white paper and you're held accountable. And to me, that's kind of working with the regulators, but also still allowing some freedom. So I mean, we're kind of going from a what was basically the Wild West into what is now kind of tightening up. And I think it also acts in the interest of the higher quality projects that are out there, and also yeah, kind of it's a signal that projects that pass the MiCA regulations are those with real utility. And so that's kind of how I also would like to, how I also see DeSci going as well, because we actually look to provide real world utility. And that's also something that I hope that the regulators are also recognizing, that we're able to innovate and continue innovating with different technologies. And yeah, basically it has good intentions. And overall, I'm optimistic. I could go on for quite a while, but I'll keep my answer short.
All right. Well, thank you for that answer. And it is our custom to let our guest have the final word, at least in terms of the substance of the salon. So is there anything else that you would like to tell our audience?
What would I like to tell the audience? So many things. I'm very, very honored in order to be hosted. Hosts. It's late in the UK. By the Transhumanist Party, and it really has been such a pleasure to engage with the audience in such a spicy, juicy set of questions, but also very fundamental questions in order to kind of dispel any, or discuss anyway, any barriers to understanding, and also what decentralized science is, how it relates to the governmental level, how voting is done, like how the Web3 technology interacts with it, how it is related to longevity. I'm very, very honored to have been to talk and to converse with the panelists, with the audience, and I hope to see some of you on Discord. And again, would love to chat about any questions or suggestions offline. And live long and prosper.
Indeed. Well, thank you, Eleanor. And this has been an absolute pleasure to have you as our guest today. We covered all the topics that I hoped we would cover, although much more remains to be said on all of them. And indeed, you anticipated it. Live long and prosper.